Today I'm speaking with Professor Mike Merrifield. He's an astronomer at the University of Nottingham. I've been filming and interviewing Mike for something like 14 years, I think. He's a mainstay of my channel's 60 Symbols and Deep Sky videos. And he's also cameoed here on Numberphile in the past. Like so many scientists, his career path is really fascinating to me. And in this discussion, I learned many things about Mike I didn't know before. So prepare for a meandering discussion about submarines, judo, and the benefits of having terrible handwriting.
I was born at a place called Bexley Heath in Kent, so just outside London.
Just outside London, like in a hospital or?
Bexley Maternity Hospital, if you want the more precise coordinates.
Oh, and here's a question. What day of the week were you born, do you know?
I'm sure I used to know. I think it was a Wednesday, but I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, we'll research that later. That can be one to check later. What were you like as a little boy? What were you into?
How little do you want to go? How small?
Like toddlers, primary school. Like, what were you into? Were you really into sport? Were you really into nerdy stuff then, or?
I don't think I was really into anything, which is a bit sad. But I don't have that many memories of being a kid, at least as a small kid. And, I remember playing with stuff, and I remember I had a little wooden engine I used to like driving up and down the garden and those kind of stuff. But I don't really remember that much about being, So we moved from Bexley Heath when I was 4, maybe. And so actually it was that was very early stuff. And I don't have that many memories of that first house at all.
What did your parents do?
So my dad was a museum curator, worked in a museum, and my mum was a housewife at the time.
So if you've got a father who's a museum curator, you're obviously surrounded by some pretty interesting stuff and curios. Did that inform you at all? Do you have memories of running around museums and looking at cool old stuff? And
no, it's tragic. No, I remember there being sometimes there was stuff around the house, and like stuff that would fill people with horror these days. Like my dad had a few swords lying around and those kinds of things. But no, it really didn't impact much upon me.
Rafe was your father?
Yep.
He was quite notable in his field.
He was, yes. I mean, he was a senior figure in archaeology. He's sort of credited with having invented rescue archaeology, this thing whereby when a builder's about to build something, there's a requirement that the archaeologists get to go in first. So he was for many years, he was a hate figure in the building profession because actually, they don't like the fact that they have to get delayed by waiting for the archaeologists to do their thing. But because this was, I guess, the 1960s, and there was a huge amount of building going on in the City of London, and the City of London was kind of his area. And so he was really pushing for there to be a lot of archaeology done, before these new buildings were going up, just to see what was there before it was covered up forever. So he's a big figure in that. And then later in his career, there was this kind of paradigm shift in archaeology that he was largely responsible for, which is that at the time, people thought, whenever you found anything in archaeology, they'd always try and find a rational explanation from it. And his argument was very often there isn't a rational explanation, that quite often things are done for ritual reasons, that there's actually, some quasi-religious or ritual thing that you're doing.
Can you give an example?
So, for example, the classic example of this is shoes under floors. Old shoes found under floors. Quite often when you're renovating an old house, you'll find there are shoes under the floor. The rational explanation is, well, somebody lost a shoe. But actually, it doesn't really hold water because, if you lost a shoe, you're not going to replace the floorboards before checking whether there's a shoe underneath it, right? And so nowadays, the generally accepted explanation is it's a kind of a ritual thing, that there's you're making some kind of deposit to some god or other. And that's the reason why very often when you look in an old house now, you'll find shoes hidden behind walls or under floors.
So I'm imagining archaeology loomed reasonably large in your life. Was it something that interested you at all as a youngster?
I'm sounding awful in all of this, but no, it all just went way over my head. I wasn't that, into it at all. And my father was kind of an old school kind of person in that, he'd do his work at work and then he'd come home and he'd, dig the garden and do all those other things that he liked doing. And so actually he didn't actually bring his work home that much with him.
So as you started to get older then and started to develop your own interests and personality and strengths and weaknesses, what would you have wanted? If I went back in time and asked you what you wanted to be when you grew up, what would you have said to me?
I would probably, at an early age, I wouldn't have a clue. When I was sort of early teens, I wanted to join the Navy. I wanted to be a submariner. For, again, reasons of which now escape me entirely. But
I never knew this about you.
Yeah, I really wanted to be a submariner, and it turned out they wouldn't have me because, so I wanted to be an officer in a submarine. Right? I wanted to ultimately be a captain of a submarine. Turns out, bizarrely, all officers in submarines are watchkeeping officers. And at the time, there was a requirement that to be a watchkeeping officer in a Navy ship, you needed to have 20/20 uncorrected vision, which I didn't have, which is bizarre in a submarine, right? Which spends most of its time not able to see anything at all, but it just was the rule. And so that kind of career path was probably providentially cut off. And so I didn't actually pursue it.
What's a watchkeeping officer?
So there are, in the Navy, there are engineering officers, right? There are people who are just like, in charge of the engines, or there are gunnery officers who are in charge of the armaments. A watchkeeping officer is one of the ones who kind of takes control of the ship, and so actually has to kind of, be able to see what's coming the other way.
So you had gotten to a point where you were thinking of applying, or had you already been told before you even went down this path, forget it because of the vision thing?
Yeah, no, I never actually applied. I was a Navy cadet when I was at school. So we had the cadets at school, and so I was in the Navy section of the cadets, mainly because I liked sailing. And we did a few things. We went sea training, and we got to go around a few nuclear submarines and things. So I got quite interested in it then. And I must have pursued it as far as finding out that they wouldn't have me, but that was as far as I went with it.
Do you still have an itch for submarines? Do you watch The Hunt for Red October and think about what might have been and stuff like that?
I kind of enjoy. I mean, why was it submarines appeal? I think it's just because it's this very sort of self-contained society, and I think that just really appealed to me. This idea that you've got this kind of microcosm of a society. Without all the complications and confusion of the big bad world most of the time.
You couldn't have gone further from being under the ocean to looking at galaxies.
It really was completely the opposite direction. Yeah, absolutely.
So what were you good at and what were you into as a sort of teenager in high school?
I was okay across the board. I went to a really bad primary school, like an awful primary school, which I won't name because I don't really want to get sued. And actually, to be fair, I did actually just out of interest look up its latest reports, and it's now an extremely good primary school. But at the time, it was awful, and the reason why it was awful is this. So this was I started there in the very late 1960s, and the teachers were kind of products of the 1960s, and had this view that that you should just let kids be kids, and you shouldn't make them do stuff, and you shouldn't ever tell them that they're wrong. And so that means that fairly basic things like learning my times tables and learning handwriting, I never did. And so I came out of primary school with illegible handwriting and not really knowing how to do arithmetic. I managed just about to scrape my way into a pretty good secondary school, and I kind of started kind of low down in that secondary school just because of this sort of start in life. And I kind of clawed things back a bit, but by the time I got to 16, so then there were these things called O-levels that you did when you were 16. I did pretty well across the board by that point. And at that point in the UK education system, you have to make this decision essentially because you cut down from the 10 or so subjects that you're doing down to 3, basically 3 or 4 subjects. And so you really at that point make a decision: do you want to do the humanities or the sciences? Which is crazy. So it's completely daft. But what made the decision for me essentially was, well, I could go the humanities route or the sciences route. The humanities route, I'd end up having to write lots of essays. The sciences route, I'd end up doing lots of maths. But the thing that had changed in between primary school and secondary school is the pocket calculator had come along. So actually my inability to multiply 2 numbers together was no longer really that much of a problem because you just bung it into the calculator. Whereas, the word processor was still many years in the future. So actually I would have been handwriting essays. So fundamentally, the reason why I ended up doing sciences is because I went to such a bad primary school that it kind of shut off the humanities, really, because no one would be able to read my writing when I wrote the essays.
Was it that illegible that you couldn't read it? Or was it hard for you to do it? Was it a chore to write?
It was more that, it was somewhere in between the two, right? My handwriting at its best is hard to read, and it's a real pain to write. And so actually I just couldn't face that idea of sort of spending the next several years basically spending all my time trying to write stuff, which I found painful to do anyway.
But did you enjoy those subjects? Did you like the idea of studying history or the humanities subjects? Or
I really did, actually. I enjoyed, which subjects did I particularly enjoy? I guess on English I really enjoyed. I enjoyed creative writing. So I really enjoyed English. I didn't enjoy history, so I gave up history at the earliest stage I could, which is probably, again, just, reacting against family type stuff. But yeah, English I really enjoyed, languages I enjoyed, and I enjoyed the maths and physics side as well. So the 2 subjects I did badly in at O-level were chemistry, which I've never had much time for, and particularly at O-level, because so much of it was just about memorizing stuff and just sort of rote learning. It was frustrating because they tell you, this is how the periodic table's arranged. And you wanted to know why, right? And that's not on the O-level syllabus, and so actually it was sort of a frustrating subject. So chemistry was one I did badly in. The other one I did badly in was English literature. And that probably was partly the handwriting thing, but also partly because, so I'd done quite well in most of we had lots of kind of assessed elements, but there was an exam as well. The exam was mostly on Romeo and Juliet.
Right.
My contempt for the play Romeo and Juliet knows no bounds. And I have a bad feeling that probably kind of came through in the essay that I wrote for my O-level, because I really didn't like the play.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds like a whole other podcast, but Mike Merrifield dissects Romeo and Juliet. What were you thinking about a career, though? You must have been getting to a point where you start imagining, oh, what am I going to do when I'm an adult? Like, did you have a dream then, now that submarines were off the table?
I probably didn't that much. I was sort of following my nose. I was quite into computers as well at that point. So I guess I was, on computers, this was, so now we're talking about very early 1980s. And at that point, computers were just really the thing that was coming up. And one of the A-levels I took was actually in computer science. So I was actually, quite into that whole side of things. So I guess I probably had in the back of my mind that there was probably a career in computing if I wanted it.
What did you know or think of astronomy at that point?
Nothing. My dad did actually buy, one of these mail order very cheap telescopes at some point, because I remember us being out in the back garden, looking at Saturn and seeing the rings of Saturn in a back garden in the middle of London at that point. But I really didn't have that much to do with astronomy at that point.
What was your first job?
I was a judo instructor.
You were a judo instructor?
My first ever job.
How old were you then?
I was 19.
So were you at university then?
So I was at university. This was a summer job.
Right.
So I got a summer job.
You obviously had already been doing judo before this, actually.
I've been doing judo, yeah. So I did judo. I started judo when I was about 10, I guess. And was, I was sort of average at it. They have these coloured belts. So I got as far as blue belt, which is sort of, it goes blue, brown, black. So I was kind of,
2 down.
A fair way towards the top. And I kind of enjoyed doing it. And I wanted a summer job. Actually, one of the other aspects of my life we hadn't talked about is when I was a kid, my parents and I decided quite early on that our idea of what constituted a holiday was different, in that they liked going around ancient monuments and things. And, when I was a kid, I didn't really. So we sort of parted company on holidays, and they go off and visit ancient Rome. And I go on one of these kids' unaccompanied holidays. And I learned to sail and canoe and all those other things you do on those adventure holidays, and had a complete blast. And because the great thing about them is you kind of get to completely reinvent yourself. So actually, because nobody there knows you. And so you can kind of, be whoever you want to be for a couple of weeks. So every year I go off on one of these and be a cool kid for a couple of weeks.
Right.
And I got really into them and really enjoyed them. And actually it turned out that it leaked back into my real life in that one year I was there being the cool kid, and somebody I knew from school turned up quite coincidentally. And I was like, oh, that's going to blow it. And unfortunately he didn't, right? And actually I was the cool kid for the week. And when I got back to school, he told everyone, yeah, you know what?
Mike's pretty cool.
He's pretty cool.
Yeah.
He gets the girls and everything, And but I got really into them. And so when I was at university, I thought, well, what can I do? I could, for a summer job, I could go along as an instructor, because it looked like when I was a kid there, it looked like the instructor has even more of a blast than the kids did.
Yeah.
So I applied for a job as a sailing instructor. And it turns out sailing instructors are 2 a penny. Everyone wants to be a sailing instructor. And it's a very popular job to do. And so I didn't get the job. But in the form, they just asked, what else can you do? And I'd mentioned I do judo. And it turns out they were setting up this place where there was going to be judo as well. Right. And so I got a job as a judo instructor. I got the job there as a judo instructor. I had a complete blast for the summer. Turns out, indeed, it is the case. The staff have even more fun than the kids do. I had a wonderful time. And yeah, that was my first job, was being a judo instructor at a kids' summer holiday.
What's your judo skills like now?
Non-existent. I gave it up at that point. That was my swan song for judo.
So as you pushed through high school, you obviously were getting decent enough marks. You've got to make decisions eventually about university. What happens next?
Yeah. So, it was a kind of fairly pushy school. And so they wanted people to be applying to Oxford and Cambridge. So I duly applied to Oxford. Again, I was sort of following my nose. I didn't have a particularly huge career ambition in mind. My sister had been to Oxford. She's quite a lot older than me, and so she'd been through Oxford and enjoyed it. And so I kind of had her experience and the fact that she'd really enjoyed being there. So I ended up applying to Oxford. And at that point, there was a separate exam that they had for getting into Oxford and Cambridge beyond the kind of the A-levels, the normal exams that you were doing. So I took that exam, which I did quite well in. I think I got quite lucky, because you put down the place so Oxford has a system of colleges, and so you say which college you wanted to go to, but also you put down kind of the second, third and fourth choices. And the first choice I put down was a college called St Catherine's, which I picked just because it doesn't look like an Oxford college. It's this, brutalist, modernist 1960s building, which just kind of appealed to me because, I was a contrarian teenager at the time, and, the other stuff was all old, and that gets us back to history again, and I don't want anything to do with that. Yeah. So I applied there, and I remember saying some really stupid things at the interview. They have an interview process, and not surprisingly, I didn't get a place there. But a couple of the other places interviewed as well. One of which was a college called Lady Margaret Hall. And I'd only applied there at all. I was filling out this list of places and I didn't know that much about Oxford colleges. So I asked my sister and she said, apply to Lady Margaret Hall because there's lots of women there.
Right.
So I put Lady Margaret Hall down. And for whatever reason, I clearly on that occasion said the right things at the interview. So I got offered a place there.
Do you have to also give them an idea what you want to study?
Oh, yeah. No, you apply for a particular subject. So I had actually at that point, so the A-levels I was taking were pure maths, applied maths, physics, and computer science. Yeah. And I really was quite enjoying the physics. I enjoyed the maths a lot too. And it was a little bit of a toss-up between applying to do maths and applying to do physics. And in the end, I applied to do physics.
For any reason or just toss of a coin?
Over the maths, I think it was probably because I liked the application of it. The fact that it is something where, you can solve a problem and then it actually has some real world implications and you can sort of weigh what you find against what you find in the real world to see whether you were right or not, whereas maths has that rather more kind of abstract flavour to it.
What was the change from school to university like for you? Like how big a step change was it?
I mean, in terms of on the academic side of things, it was a big change. I mean, the change in teaching style is enormous, and it's something we still face with students today, right? That actually this, you go from a rather well nurtured environment in school where everything's done in classes and you're taken through things to a system where there are lectures and where you're expected to be much more in charge of your own education. And that was probably even more the case then, that, no one made you go to the lectures. If you didn't go to the lectures, it was your problem. And then, then you just fall flat on your face when you came to do the exams at the end of the year. So it was quite a big change from that point of view.
Were you well suited to that?
Only because I did actually go to the lectures. I'm one of these people that as long as there's a structure there, I can kind of force myself to do it and then everything's fine. It's like now, these days I exercise pretty regularly and I'm probably fitter than I have been for quite a while. But the reason for that is just because I do the same thing every day and I get into that kind of routine. And, I hate it when I'm doing it, but because I'm in the routine, I keep doing it. It was the same then. I always went to the lectures. I never thought, I'll catch up on this later, because it wouldn't have worked. And so even if I didn't feel like going to the lectures, I did actually go along and sort of engage with all the stuff I was meant to, just because that's the kind of way I am, that once I start getting into that kind of routine, I stick with it.
And once you're at university and studying physics, Did you start finding a niche? Did you find a passion then, or?
Not for the first couple of years. So the degree program then had very few choices in it until you got to the final year, the third year of the degree. And at that point, you had to do these things called options, right? So everything was fairly prescribed until you reached that final year. And we got to the final year and you have to pick these options. And I didn't have any particular kind of huge leanings one way. I still wasn't that into astronomy at that point. I was sort of vaguely interested in it, but it wasn't a huge part of my life. And so we get to these options, and most of them are things like advanced nuclear physics and further solid state physics, where we've already done a whole load of stuff already, and it's kind of more advanced material on it. There were just two things we hadn't done at all before, which were geophysics and astronomy. And we had to pick two options. And I figured, well, if I pick the two we haven't done anything at all on before, they'll have to start with the easy stuff. So they're going to be easier options. So I duly picked the astronomy and the geophysics options. And sure enough, they did start with the easy stuff. And that was great because it meant that you kind of got an introduction to a whole new kind of subject. And it wasn't that challenging, at least when you started. But I also got really into the astronomy side of it. I mean, I enjoyed the geophysics too, but the astronomy really kind of bit me at that point.
Do you remember what it was about astronomy that bit you?
I think this is weird because this kind of goes back to my father again, right? I actually found that I liked the archaeological aspect of it. The fact that you don't have complete control over things. You have to take what you're given and try and figure out what's going on.
You're picking over the ruins.
You are, and you're trying to reconstruct on the basis of this sort of fragmentary information that you get what it all means. And so it really is, in that sense, very like archaeology. It's taking those fragmentary bits and pieces and trying to put it together into a coherent story that explains things, and then say, okay, if I'm right, then I also ought to see this. And so then you can go and do that experiment. So I really like that kind of almost sort of criminal investigation side of it, that you're actually trying to kind of put things back together again on the basis of the information that you've got.
So as you complete through the options, astronomy sounds like finally astronomy's bitten you. What happens when you come to the end of your degree?
So I'm getting to the end of the degree, and it's basically, well, what am I going to do next? I did actually apply and got offered a job. I applied to ICI, big chemical company.
You hate chemistry.
I know, isn't it bizarre? I applied for this job as a control engineer. So they're the people who stop chemical plants from blowing up. Basically, they put the safety processes in place. And I went through this quite lengthy process. ICI had this kind of recruitment process. It was an amazingly complicated process, the last stage of which involved them taking their kind of shortlist candidates to a country house hotel somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and doing all sorts of weird things. Like we sat down to dinner the first evening, and the first dish that was presented was shellfish, with all the tools to get the shellfish out of the shells. And in retrospect, it was clear that this wasn't just dinner, right? This was actually part of the assessment. Who's going to be the first person who actually tries to figure out how to do this?
Right.
And
I
so,
hate that stuff.
I know. So anyway, so we went through all that, and they did offer me a job.
You obviously were good with the shellfish.
I clearly didn't completely embarrass myself with the shellfish, and dealt with all the other bits and pieces that they threw at us. And it was, I actually because again, it was this problem solving stuff I really quite enjoyed doing. So they offered me a job, but at the same time, I was sort of thinking, well, I'd actually like to see a bit of the world as well. And so, I don't quite know how the thought first occurred to me, but I realized that, I could go on and actually study for a PhD, and I didn't have to do it in the UK. And at the time, that was pretty unusual, right? Most people didn't travel overseas to do, for education and between undergraduate and postgraduate studies. But I did sort of hit on this idea that it would be great to go to the US and do a PhD in the US. I must have had quite a lot of commitment to it, because it's quite hard work, because the world really wasn't set up for, British people going to the US to do PhDs. I mean, some people did it, but it wasn't an easy thing to do. And so you had to do this thing called the Graduate Record Exam, which was an exam that would get you into a PhD program in America, which was completely different from any exam I'd done before, because it was kind of this multiple choice thing, which is not something that you do much in UK education. And you had to apply to all these places and fill in all these forms and put in all these applications. And I applied to about 4 places in the US and got offered places. So I, in the end decided, well, and I still had this job offer from ICI. So I was thinking, weighing these two things up against each other. In the end, I decided I just wanted to have a bit of fun for a few years and see a bit of the world and study a bit more astronomy.
And where did you go to do that?
So I went to Harvard.
And presumably, obviously you had to pass this exam, but you also presumably had to find a PhD supervisor who liked the cut of your jib and had a topic for you. Who was that, and where did you go, and what did you specialise in?
So in the US system's a bit different from the UK system. US undergraduates do a broader education. They sort of do a major in astronomy, typically, if they're going to go on to do a PhD. They've done a whole bunch of other stuff as well, which means they haven't done stuff to quite the same depth. In the UK system, you've done this very narrow thing to a greater depth. And so in the UK system, you can kind of go straight from an undergraduate degree into doing research, essentially, because you know the physics that you need to know, or the astronomy you need to know. In the US system, you don't. So they actually use like the first year and a half of their postgraduate program doing coursework. And so during that time, you don't need a supervisor for your PhD, and you can kind of spend that time chatting to people, figuring out what you want to do, figuring out who you might want to work for. So I spent that first year, kind of the year and a bit, doing essentially that, of chatting to people.
And the coursework would have been pretty easy for you, I imagine, because you were a bit more specialised than your colleagues? In
principle, yeah. In practice, so the bit that I missed out of the story is that between being an undergraduate and starting my PhD, I was actually ill for a year. So I'd actually kind of been out of the system for a year.
A year?
Yeah.
What were you ill with?
It's an interesting question.
Okay, right.
In that I was basically nauseous for a year. I just felt completely sick.
Oh, right.
It's something that's actually stayed with me ever since, to a greater or lesser extent. There are some times where a year goes by and I feel fine, and then suddenly it comes back again. And I've been poked and prodded by so many doctors about this. To be honest, at this point, I think it's probably a mental health thing. I think it's probably my brain creating this problem from time to time, in that the thing that fixed it the first time is, again, that year when I was being sick, I was being poked and prodded by lots of doctors. None of them found anything much wrong. In the end, they put me on antidepressants, and that's what turned it around in the end. So I suspect it's probably a mental health issue.
How did having a year out put you behind the curve when you finally went over to the US then?
It wasn't so bad, in the sense that because they did start from this slightly lower level, it meant that was kind of probably the right level for me at that point. So I kind of matched back into it reasonably well. I actually was still ill when I went. So the other thing that sort of disrupted my first year as a PhD student was I spent bits of it in hospital, again, being prodded by doctors.
That doesn't sound fun.
No. And the way, if you're feeling sick, they do all sorts of very unpleasant things to you to try and find out what might be making making you feel sick. So yes, I don't recommend it if you can avoid it.
Okay, I'll try. So after this early stage of the PhD, you eventually are specialising. What do you specialise in?
Typically, finding a PhD supervisor and finding the right match can be quite a tricky thing to do. And sometimes, it's hard to find somebody who actually wants to supervise a PhD student. The nice thing is I was at this place called the Center for Astrophysics. So Harvard houses this thing called the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, which is both Harvard run and the Smithsonian Institution. So it's actually a very big organization. At the time I was there were 250 potential supervisors. There are 250 people there with PhDs who could supervise a PhD. It's huge. It's like it's well up into the thousands of people there now. It's this enormous place. But even then, it was a very big place, which meant that actually you're kind of spoiled for choice. And because Harvard takes 4 or 5 PhD students a year, and there's 250 people there who might want a PhD student, it's not that hard to find a supervisor.
Are you picking a supervisor based on the person or based on the topic?
Bit of both, really. And it's kind of a fairly common thing. It's important when you're doing a PhD to pick not only a topic that you're interested in, but actually somebody you get on with, because you're going to be working with them quite a lot. And it's really important there isn't some clash of personalities or those kinds of things. So I ended up working for a guy called Steve Kent, who I ended up working for essentially because he was teaching. So as I said, we spent the first year and a bit doing courses, and he actually taught one of those courses. And I just really liked his style when he was teaching, and I kind of liked the stuff that he was teaching.
Which was what?
So he was teaching galaxy dynamics, so the motions of stars in galaxies, and which is essentially what I then went on to do my PhD on.
Because I guess when a lot of people think of astronomy at that superficial level, they're thinking of the planets and moons and stuff. But you're a galaxy man.
I'm definitely a galaxy man, and at that point, it really was dynamics. It was the motions of things within galaxies. I was very interested in how the stars, how they stick together, how the structure is arranged, and again, coming back to this archaeology thing, how that arrangement tells you what it tells you about how the thing got put together in the first place.
What else could you study to do with galaxies besides that?
To study the motions of stars in galaxies, you end up taking a lot of spectra, because you actually want to measure the Doppler shifts in the lines and things to see whether the stars are moving towards you or away from you or in some complicated fashion. But there are lots of other things you could do. You could be studying, just taking images of galaxies. You could be looking for things which might be varying with time, like supernova going off in galaxies, to learn about their stellar populations, what the kind of stars they're made up from. So lots of different ways of trying to tackle, why galaxies look the way they do.
Just a very quick break to thank our episode sponsor, Jane Street, and they're a very appropriate supporter indeed. Jane Street is a trading firm that leans really heavily into research and the curiosity side of things. Now, they're not here today to sell you anything. Don't touch your credit card. Don't worry about promo codes. Rather, Jane Street is well aware that the sort of people who listen to this podcast are the exact people they'd love to see working on their teams across the world. Puzzle solvers, mathematical minds, coders, computery types. With offices in the likes of New York, London and Hong Kong, Jane Street is a great place to work, and they really make sure their people are well looked after. To find out more about all this, go to janestreet.com and click on the section that says Join Jane Street. You'll see a list of what's available, from full-time jobs, internships, and a range of great programs and events. They're running great stuff all the time. You'll also find on the site more about just how well they look after their people, all the great workspaces, the perks, that kind of stuff. So who knows, maybe you're at the start of your career, maybe you're at a crossroads. Wherever you're at, go to janestreet.com, check out Join Jane Street. And now, back to our interview with Mike. I'm going to pause for a second and put my Numberphile hat on a bit more firmly. How important was and is mathematics at this point? How good do you have to be at mathematics to be an astronomer at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, or anywhere else for that matter?
It varies. I mean, there's a whole spectrum, right? You need a certain level of mathematics. That's kind of unavoidable. But there are people who really, study the equations which dictate, in my case, for example, the motions of stars within galaxies, and prove theorems about them and do all those things that mathematicians do. So it's kind of mathematical physics. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who largely go out and observe galaxies, and the interpretation bit is kind of the bit on the end, having made their observations, which probably has a little bit of maths in it.
That'll be more basic.
Much more basic, and even taking maths that somebody else has already done and showing whether it's right or not. So actually not that much maths involved themselves.
Is it common that a less mathematical astronomer teams up with a very mathematical one and they tackle a problem in the two ways? Or
sometimes, although sometimes you reach this situation where you're not even speaking the same language as each other, so it sometimes can be quite difficult to get that kind of interface between the theory side and the observation side. But that's obviously the ideal thing, is that astronomy is one of those subjects where everyone does a bit of both. So even if you're an observer, you do a bit of the theory side. If you're a theorist, you probably have to understand the nature of the data well enough that to make sure you're not over-interpreting what you're doing.
What are some of the mathematical tools that are used that I might be familiar with? Like, what are some of the disciplines that you dip into? I mean,
so again, it's across the board. There are people who do, computer simulation. So basically that's because, if you simulate a galaxy in a computer, essentially you're solving the equations which dictate the motions of the stars and the gas within that to understand what's going on. So you really are, you're solving a set of differential equations. You're just using a computer to do it. We tend not to think of it in those terms. We tend to think of it, in sort of more physical terms of, you're following the motions of stars within the galaxy. But essentially you're just solving a set of equations when you do that. So there's the numerical side of things. But there are also, there's the more kind of mathematical side of things of essentially solving equations on a piece of paper. So the guy I ended up working for, Steve Kent, the reason why I ended up working for him is, in passing, in one of his lectures, he was deriving a bunch of results from a set of equations and essentially the equations which dictate the motions of stars within galaxies. And just as a throwaway point, at some point he said, and of course, so-and-so can't be done. And, I was a bolshy, what would I have been, 20, 21-year-old at the time. And so I thought, well, bugger it, I'm going to go and do this, right? And so that night I sat down with a piece of paper and spent most of the night. This is probably one of the only times I've actually worked on science through the night, because I was, obviously when I'm observing I do, but, actually focusing on solving a problem. And I got so into it that I spent the entire night solving this problem, didn't sleep that night. And in the end showed that he was wrong. And actually you can derive this result that he said couldn't be derived.
It's a Goodwill Hunting moment, wasn't it?
It really was. And it was, it's probably the most hardcore maths I've ever done in my life, which involved, it was lots of solving integrals and doing clever tricks about, multiple integrals where you reverse the order of integration and all sorts of mathematical games I played. That was, really the pinnacle of my knowledge of mathematics. And as I say, at the end of it, I solved it. And then I wrote it up to look nice. This back in the day when people handwrote their equations rather than typing them into computers. So
your best Mike Merrifield handwriting.
It really, but actually by that point, I figured out that if I wrote everything in block capitals, what I wrote was fairly legible. So I wrote this thing out in block capitals, right? But it was mostly maths, so that's all right. And my maths is fairly legible because I was just writing individual characters. Anyway, so next morning, I go into the office with this thing early in the morning. I stick it under his door. Then I went back and slept, right? Because, I was exhausted by that point. And so the next day I dropped by to see him and he read it by then. And he said, this is really good. And, let's write a paper about this. And do you want to come and do a PhD with me? Was essentially the way the conversation went. Yeah. So I ended up doing a PhD with this guy. And that was it turned out that wasn't the first paper we ended up publishing together. We did some observational work together and I analysed some of the data that he got as the first paper. But I think it was probably the second paper we ended up writing together.
Nice one. I'll have to look that up sometime. You complete your PhD presumably, because I call you doctor and professor. So yep. I hope you did complete it.
I did, yes.
What did you do next?
So the career path for somebody, and at that point I was kind of quite committed to it. I was really enjoying the science.
Was your father still alive?
At that point, yes, he was still alive.
What did he think about you pursuing astronomy?
I think he was probably a little bemused by it, but he was quite proud, I think. He and my mum came over for my graduation from Harvard, so that was a big deal. They came to America for the first time and saw me graduating. So that was all very nice.
That was all right. Did you ever make that archaeology astronomy link with him? Say, I feel like I'm doing what you do, but in space.
I think we did have that conversation a few times, I think. And then and this is probably leaping ahead a little bit, but one of the pinnacles of my mum's life, she was very proud of both me and my dad, right? My dad had a really interesting progression through his kind of academic path in that he was the son of a station porter who died when he was very young. So he was brought up by his mum.
A train station
porter. So he didn't have an academic background at all. He ended up doing kind of a part-time degree in London. So he was living in Brighton, did a part-time degree in London, which is where he met my mum. But so he sort of pulled himself up by his bootstraps from very little education to doing a degree to moving into museums and so on. But he didn't go beyond his undergraduate degree. So he didn't do a PhD. But kind of late in his career, he got given an honorary doctorate for his contributions to archaeology by the University of London, which was, obviously a very proud moment for everyone. But just after he got it, I was home visiting and somebody phoned and asked for Dr. Merrifield. And my mum got to say, which one? And you could hear her kind of glowing with pride when she said this. So anyway, so that was a diversion. What were we supposed to be talking about?
Well, yeah, you are Dr.
Oh yes,
Merrifield
I'm now Dr. Merrifield.
Where's the younger Dr. Merrifield?
Yes, I'm the other Dr. Merrifield. So the standard career path is you do a PhD. If you want to kind of pursue that academic career path, you typically do these things called postdocs, which are these relatively short-term positions where you work for 2 or 3 years at a place and then you move on to another one and you kind of build up your research portfolio and hopefully your reputation to a point where you can get a permanent academic post somewhere. And you typically apply to a whole bunch of places because they're all very competitive. I ended up getting offered a job at a place called CETA, which is the Canadian Institute for Theoretical Astrophysics, based in Toronto, based at the University of Toronto in Toronto. So I moved from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Toronto in Canada for a couple of years as a postdoc there. And it was they were nice postdocs in the sense that, so CETA was set up very much with postdocs in mind. There weren't many faculty. There were a lot of postdocs. And so it was a very kind of young, vibrant environment to be doing it. But it was a little bit scary in the sense that most postdocs, you end up going to work for a person to do a particular thing. For CETA, they just give you a fellowship. And essentially you turn up and they say, okay, well, there's your desk, there's your computer, do something interesting. Right. and so you really are, for the first time, really kind of pushed in pretty much at the deep end to swim. In retrospect, I think there probably was kind of people were keeping an eye on how things were going. And if you were really struggling, people would say, here's an interesting thing you might want to work on.
Because that sounds really hard, because obviously in astronomy, a key thing from what I know of astronomy is to try and get observation time on telescopes maybe, or wait, so you can get some data to get your teeth into. But I imagine prestigious professors and doctors find it easier to get that time than some lowly postdoc. So you're really you must really be in the wilderness looking for help.
There is that danger. I mean, even at that point, so the first thing I did when I was there, actually just used some data that even then was 20 years old. It was some old radio data. And I just had this idea about a way to analyze that data that no one had done before. Right. So even then there was kind of archival data you could get your hands on. Nowadays things are much better in that there are many, many archives and lots of these big surveys and things. So that there are lots of data that everyone could get hold of. But even then, so I started doing stuff. I started working with a guy called Conrad Kaiken, who was another of the postdocs there. Again, you get these kind of relationships in science sometimes. You just kind of bounce things off each other and get kind of more than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So we worked really well together. So started doing projects together while we were at CETA and continued for many years after that, working together on a variety of projects. We're kind of nicely complementary from that perspective.
So your time at CETA obviously has beefed up your CV a bit. You've got more papers under your belt. What do you do then?
So at that point, I was starting to get a little homesick. I wanted to come back to the UK. And there were a couple of reasons for that. Partly my parents were getting older and I thought, I wanted to spend a little bit more time with them. There's also, I've kind of glossed over, but there's kind of a love story going on in the background as well. Right. In that I met the person who's now my wife when we were undergraduates together. Right. So back in Oxford.
Oh, so you'd kept that going long distance? Or?
We kept it going for a while and then we kind of went our separate ways. But then we kind of got back in touch with each other and we're just sort of sending each other letters, and because back in those days you didn't send people email, you sent them letters. No. And so we were kind of sort of getting back in touch with each other, and so I thought it'd be nice to come back to the UK. And so I started looking for jobs in the UK, and I came across a postdoc position with a guy called Ian McHardy at Southampton University back in the UK. So I applied for that and managed to get that job. So I then came back to the UK.
But you're still in postdoc world.
So I'm still in postdoc world. So this is now my second postdoc.
I've heard of the postdoc trap where you just go from postdoc to postdoc.
Yep. And I was sort of intent on not falling into it, in that I had reached a decision, okay, this is it. This is my last postdoc. I'm not doing any more of these. Just because there is this danger, you end up in this internal sort of cycle of these short-term positions. And every time you move, it gets harder, right? When I moved to the US, my entire life fitted into 2 suitcases. When I moved back from Canada, I needed a shipping container to bring back my life from Canada. Just because you get more stuff and it's more hassle to move and you just, you want to settle down and all those things. Plus, by that point, I was back in a relationship with the person who's now my wife. And she had her own career, so I couldn't be dragging her around the world. So there were all sorts of reasons why I was thinking, okay, this is the end of the line for astronomy for me. But one of the routes out of the postdoc trap is to get a long-term fellowship, like a 5 or 7 year fellowship.
This is where an organisation funds your work for a number of years.
Yeah, so for example, in the UK, the two big funders of this are the research councils fund these fellowships and the Royal Society fund these fellowships as well. And the reason why they're a route out is because it turns out that if you can get 5 years of money, you can then go to the university you're at and say, okay, and the nice thing about these fellowships is they're portable. You can move them from places. So you can go to your current head of department and say, okay, you can have me free for 5 years, but in return, I want a permanent job at the end. And that's a negotiation which works reasonably well. And in fact, if your current institution won't do it, another institution almost certainly will. So these are a pretty good route into a permanent career in science.
Right.
And I'd applied 1 year. I got nowhere. I applied to the Royal Society. I got nowhere. Didn't even get an interview with them. So I thought, okay, I'll do one more cycle of this, and then it's time to start thinking about, that career in computing or whatever else it's going to be. So I put in my final application. Royal Society didn't interview me again, but the Research Council one, what was then called PPARC, which was the Research Council that funded astronomy, gave me an interview. So I went through the interview process. It was quite an astounding interview process because it's clear. So they interview a lot of people for these fellowships. I was there at the end of the second day of interviewing. They'd done 2 solid days of interviewing, and this is the interview panel, and they're sitting kind of slumped in their seats around the table, and there's spilled coffee everywhere, and the whole and it's clear, these people it's total carnage. So I went through this thing, and it went reasonably well. And actually, as I was walking out, one of the people on the committee whispered to me as I went out, "Good job." So I thought, yes.
Oh, good.
And that worked out, and I got offered the fellowship.
So now you've got the big bargaining chip.
So now I've got the big bargaining chip, which I took to my boss at Southampton and said, so I got one of these fellowships. What are you going to do about it?
So you're saying you can have me for free for X number of years, and then.
Yep. So I played my card, and they duly made the offer and said, yeah, all right, we'll do that. You can, for 5 years you do. And there's a quid pro quo, right? They have you for 5 years. You do a little bit of teaching during those 5 years, which they get for free. But then at the end of it, they kind of offer you a permanent position at the end.
Right.
So that was sort of me finally set. And, as with all these things, it's a complete chain of chance that gets you to that point, right? As to where you happen to end up being, the panel on the day you happen to apply for the fellowship, the fact that when you were an undergraduate, you picked the subject that you thought was going to be easy because you hadn't done it before. This whole kind of chain of chance gets you to that point.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that point, I'm all set at that point.
Okay. Southampton, that's the start of your career as a grown-up astronomer.
Yep.
You're not in Southampton anymore because we're sitting in Nottingham.
Yep. So there's one more move.
Yep.
So I've got this 5-year fellowship. I'm coming towards the end of the 5-year fellowship. So I'm still a postdoc. I'm still on this 5-year fellowship. And again, and we're back with chance again, I happened to see an advert. It was in a newspaper for a new professor of astronomy at the University of Nottingham, because there's no astronomy at Nottingham at the time. And they've been thinking about what areas they might want to expand into, what new things they might like to do. Astronomy is very popular with physics departments. Firstly, because it's very attractive to undergraduates, because undergraduates like astronomy. And secondly, because it's cheap, because we don't need labs and stuff. We do use very expensive pieces of kit, but they're all these national and international facilities, not something that the university has to pay for. So at the time, most physics departments were kind of expanding into astronomy, and Nottingham was one of the later places to do it. So they were applying, they put out this advert saying they wanted to set up this new astronomy group, and they needed a professor of astronomy and with, probably 2 lecturers to go with it to set up this new research group. And so I applied, not because I had any expectation at all of getting it. I was far too junior.
Because this would have been like, setting it up.
It's setting up, yeah. And I'm still a postdoc, right? I'm not even faculty at that point. I'm still going through this fellowship. So I'm very junior. But again, clearly I'm a fairly obnoxious and pushy individual. And so I thought, well, why not? And really, I was doing it not because I expected to get it, but more to put Southampton kind of on notice of I'm going somewhere kind of thing. And, support me or else kind of thing. So I put in an application. I was somewhat surprised to be shortlisted. I went along to the interview. Again, the interview wasn't my finest hour. It's funny when you think back on these things. The only thing you ever remember about them are the really stupid things you said. But anyway, I must have said some good things as well as some stupid things.
Yeah.
And they actually ended up appointing 2 of us. They got to a point where they couldn't decide who to appoint. So there was me and this guy, Peter Coles. And the Vice Chancellor just kind of snapped his fingers and said, okay, well, clearly they're both good. Why don't we have 2 of them? And so Peter and I set up the group. And started, and we made an argument that basically said, well, look, you were originally going to appoint 1 professor and 2 lecturers. Since you've appointed 2 professors, clearly you need more lecturers. We also played this game of getting people who had fellowships because again, you can play this game of, well, look, we can have this person for free for 5 years, so let's have 2 of them. So we ended up growing the group much more rapidly than the university or the physics department expected, and really turned it into the fairly thriving thing it is today.
I mean, you've done various things. You've been the head of the physics school here and whatnot. You've also done lots of research. I know you've written a textbook that's quite well known. What's kind of like, what would be, I hope you have more left in you of course. I hope you have more astronomy left in you, of course, as well. I'm sure you do. But like, as of now, what would be like, what's the thing you're most pleased with that you've accomplished as an astronomer, research-wise, perhaps?
Probably it was the book. Just because it was this, it's the biggest monolithic thing I've ever done. So I wrote it with a guy called James Binney. Again, this comes down to these chance things, right? So the book called Galactic Astronomy. There was an earlier edition of it called Galactic Astronomy by Michaelis and Binney. Okay, it was the 2 authors. And it was clearly very out of date. And James Binney said, well, look, we need to update it. And Michaelis said, well, I don't want anything to do with it. I've had enough of writing books. So James was looking for a co-author, and I wasn't his first choice. But somebody wrote 1 chapter with him and said, oh, I can't stand any more of this. I'm not doing any more of that. So James approached me. And I think the reason he approached me was because this was while I was on that 5-year fellowship. And he was thinking, well, this is somebody who's got a bit of spare time to do this stuff, because it's a big commitment. And typically, if you're in if you're a member of faculty, you don't have time because you're doing all this teaching. If you're on a short-term postdoc, you don't have time because you have to be thinking about the next job you're applying for. You can't make those. So I was in that kind of position of being able to invest the time to write the book. And so James and I wrote this book between us.
And it's kind of a catch-all for galactic astronomy, obviously.
At the time, it's now. So it came out in 1998, so it's horrendously out of date now. Things have moved on a long way. But at the time, it was kind of supposed to be the definitive view of what we know about galaxies, kind of slightly from the perspective of the Milky Way and working outwards to other galaxies, which probably isn't the way you do the book if you were doing it now. But yeah, it's sort of this overview of what we know about galaxies. And it's sort of a undergraduate, postgraduate level kind of textbook, really.
This is obviously synthesizing a lot of research done by the whole astronomical community. What about you yourself, research-wise? Has there been sort of a most cited paper, or sort of there's no Merrifield phenomena out there or anything, but is there a thing you're associated with, or you associate yourself with at least? I'm
happy to say I don't know what my most cited paper is, which is sort of good news, right? Because it means I'm not the kind of person who sits there looking up their own citations all the time. So I don't actually know what my most cited work is. What am I happiest about?
Has there ever been a moment where you've realized something, or just feel like you've sort of discovered something, or like you thought, oh, I think I've figured that out, and then
Probably,
turns out you're right?
I mean, probably the biggest example of that was that thing that got me my PhD supervisor in the first place, right? That was the classic example of that. And that, interestingly, that's been a very slow burn, in the sense that it was I showed it that in theory something is possible, right? And the interesting thing is that since then, the world's kind of caught up with that, in the sense that people are now doing the stuff that I said that was possible in theory. That's really rather satisfying, that having, derived this result, which at the time was this very abstract kind of thing, people are actually now using it to get real results in astronomy and learn a bit about the way the universe works.
Is there an executive summary of what it involves, what it's about? We've talked about it so much now, I have to ask.
Okay, so it's to do with the fact that if you could measure the speed at which a whole bunch of stars are moving in a galaxy or a cluster of stars or whatever it is, you'll find they have a distribution of speeds, right? They don't all move at the same speeds. And in particular, if they're all moving in fairly random directions, then you find that typically the distribution looks pretty much like a Gaussian.
Some of them are going really fast, some of them are really slow. Most of them are going normal.
Well, actually, the most as with the Gaussian, the most common thing is 0. So actually, the motion along the line, if you're measuring, for example, the motion along the line of sight, the most common answer you'll get is 0. And then there's kind of a tail of things out to higher and higher velocities. So some are moving towards you, some are moving away from you, and you end up with this sort of tail. But there's this characteristic distribution you get in all over the place in physics, this thing called a normal curve or a Gaussian curve. And more or less, the motions of stars follow a Gaussian curve, their motions towards you or away from you.
Yeah.
But not quite. And so what I was looking at was the departures from that Gaussian shape and what that tells you about the orbits that the stars are following. And it turns out you can learn a lot from that the departures from that Gaussian shape. It's very hard to measure because essentially you're trying to measure, well, how much stuff is there in the tails of the distribution way out here? And the answer is it 1 star or 2 stars, right? And so it's really hard to measure. And as soon as you've got any noise at all, it gets even harder to measure. But that is essentially, I showed that there is a kind of fundamental piece of information that you can learn from the departures from the Gaussian shape. And in particular, there's this sort of fundamental result in physics called the virial theorem, which relates sort of the width of that distribution to the mass of the galaxy that it's sat in. So that a more massive galaxy, the characteristic random speed gets higher and higher. So that's this thing called the virial theorem. I showed that there were kind of analogues of the virial theorem associated not just with the width of the distribution, but actually the detailed shape of the distribution and how much it departs from that Gaussian shape. And as I say,
we'll put a link in the show notes to your paper.
Okay. And it was horrendously hard to measure. As I say, it was really sort of slightly a theoretical result. And it was sort of to do with showing actually you can use that shape information to learn more about the distribution of the orbits and actually also to learn about the mass of the galaxy in this new independent way, because the virial theorem is a way of measuring the mass of the galaxy. I showed actually there's another way to measure the mass of the galaxy in this rather subtler way. At the time, there was nowhere near enough data to actually do this. But now there is, and actually people are using this method to measure the mass of galaxies and measure the distribution of mass within galaxies, learn about dark matter, all that kind of stuff. It's sort of this very kind of theoretical result that I came up with is now actually being used to learn something about the real properties of galaxies.
Mike, when I first started working with astronomers like you, I sort of created this picture in my head that astronomers either decide they want to discover something or they have a theory they want to then prove is the case. They apply for time on these telescopes, whether it's the ones here on Earth or maybe the ones up in space. They get approved. Yes, you can have 2 hours of this telescope on this night. You point it where you want to point it. You find out if you're right or wrong, or you discover something new. It now seems to me a lot more of the time, astronomers are actually using pre-existing observations, huge reams of data, surveys that have been done in the past, and they're just picking over the wreckage in a new way or looking for something new in that existing data that no one has seen before. Is it more that way? Is it 50-50? Is it more one of the other? How does it work being an astronomer, a research astronomer?
I mean, it's sort of evolved with time, right? In that when my career started, the first thing you described of this model of having an idea, applying for time on a telescope, making your observations, analysing the observations, interpreting them, writing a paper, that really was the way it worked for the vast majority of astronomers. Now, I would say probably the majority of the astronomers are in the other model where there are these big surveys going on, they're part of large teams, and they're all trying to come up with clever new things to do with these large data sets. Astronomy's gone from being, when I started it, we were incredibly data starved, right? There wasn't that much data, and you would really fight for every photon and pick over everything and really analyze your particular little bit of data. Now we're very data rich. There are these massive surveys going on. There are so many ways you could mine that data that people are kind of always coming up with new things to do with the existing data.
That feels like more and more of a role for mathematics. There's a lot of number crunching.
There is a lot of number crunching. That probably the biggest change and the biggest thing that's revolutionizing the way these data is being mined is machine learning, right? That actually people are able to analyze huge amounts of data in ways that they haven't even thought of themselves because the machine learning comes up with the ideas for them. So actually that's probably the biggest change in terms of the way we're analyzing the data, is that a lot more of it is more automated and actually letting the machines take over to an extent as well.
How do you feel about that? You strike me as more of an old school kind of guy.
I'm very old school. I have somewhat facetiously, because the other thing that goes with this is astronomy is being done in bigger and bigger groups. When I started out, you'd do your papers on your own, or, like I got together in this collaboration with Conrad Kike, and we wrote papers together. We just sort of sit down and have ideas together. I love that. I love that kind of being able to see, working in a small group, working something through from all the way from that initial idea, sitting in the bar with someone chatting, writing things on the back of a beer mat, all the way through to proposing to observe, going out, making the observations yourself, analysing the data, writing the paper. I love that whole process. If you're doing stuff in these big collaborations, you don't do that anymore so much because you're just a cog in a machine and you're probably responsible for some part of the data reduction pipeline and so on. And, as I've somewhat facetiously said in the past, if I'd wanted to do that kind of science, I'd have become a particle physicist because that's very much the model for experimental particle physics, right? They do these huge monolithic experiments, which by their very nature involve huge numbers of people, all of whom specialize in some little bit of the experiment. And I don't find that interesting. I really don't. I love this, being able to see everything through from that beginning to end and seeing the whole project and managing the whole project and doing the whole thing yourself.
But is that a sign of the maturity of the science? Like, does it get to a point where you know too much for one person to be able to do that anymore? It is, that's the problem with particle physics, isn't it? Like,
and it's the same thing. And actually, it's because and it's cost too, right? It's the other thing that, as with particle physics, astronomy is getting more and more expensive. The telescopes we're building. So we're building this extremely large telescope now, which I'm involved a bit with, which is, it costs about £1 billion, €1 billion, $1 billion. It's a billion for pretty much whatever currency you want, or plus. It's more than that. And so these kind of facilities, you can only afford to have one or two in the world. And it's the same with the particle physicists. Their cutting edge, colliders there's only one at any given time. And that means if you have to work, unless you're going to have more, if you're only going to have one astronomer or one particle physicist, you end up having to work in these large collaborations. And they're big projects which do need lots of people. So the nature of the subject kind of changes as the technology changes, kind of necessity.
It feels like astronomy's in a good place, but it always feels like astronomy's in a good place because there's always cool new pictures on the news, isn't there? Black holes and all the stuff we're getting from JWST and things like that. Is astronomy in a good place at the moment?
I think so. We do have this great thing that there's always stuff that's just beyond what we can do with the current technology. And again, it is largely technology driven that, back in the 1990s, early 1990s, we didn't know anything about planets going around other stars, right? And now not only have we detected them and been able to show they're there, we can actually even take pictures of them. You can see a planet going around another star. But we're not quite yet, and we're just getting to the point now of actually being able to analyze the atmospheres of those planets to understand more about what was going on in those planets. So some of the JWST data, the early JWST data, was actually looking at the atmosphere of an exoplanet. And it's one of the big things we'll be able to do with the ELT. But eventually, you reach a point where not only can you study the atmospheres, but you can actually look for these things called biomarkers. You can look for life on these planets. So all the time, because the technology is pushing forwards, the things you can do is you can take the things that you know about and learn more about them. And of course, while you're doing that, you discover a whole bunch of other things that you didn't know anything about. And that then gives you the raw material for the next generation of stuff of, well, we've discovered this whole new class of things while we were trying to find something else. And now what are we going to learn about those? So there's no end in sight, I think.
Obviously, there's been a lot of interesting things happening in traditional proper astronomy, like these telescopes and new discoveries. Also, there's been this real renaissance for human exploration, partly because of all the private stuff that's being done, but also NASA and whatnot are getting their act together again. I never think of that actually as astronomy, but is that something astronomy rides on the coattails of as well and is able to sort of keep itself relevant?
I think so, because in the public perception, the two are very closely connected together. And you're quite right that at a practical level, there's very little interaction between planetary exploration and astronomy. I mean, there are planetary scientists who use telescopes to study planets and are very happy when a space probe goes and gets them a closer up view, right? But for people like me who study galaxies, you don't get any closer to another galaxy by sending a space probe out. So there isn't that much connection between the two, but it clearly excites the public. And, when we go to Mars, there's going to be a massive thing again about interest in science and astronomy. And science in general benefits when these things happen as well.
As a galactic astronomer, when we start going to Mars, is that good for you or bad for you? Because I can see how it would be good for you because space is becoming more relevant and more money's coming in and people are pro-space. But on the other hand, that pot of money that is going into spacey stuff might start going more into Mars stuff and less into where you want it to go.
There is that, but it's not a zero-sum game, right? The more interest there is in science, the more money goes into science.
The rising tide lifts all the boats.
It does. It really does. And it's not... So, no, there isn't that kind of level of competition, I don't think. And I'll be as excited as anybody else when somebody first lands on Mars.
I know you have lots of opinions on everything, Mike. But one thing I do want to mine your opinions on is a little bit is I'm imagining some of the people who've listened to this far will be quite interested in sort of career path and progression. Some of them may want to be an astronomer. You obviously have a lot to do with admissions and see students coming in all the time into university. What have you got to say about that? Have you got advice or just observations about the sort of people who are coming through that want to be astronomers, that want to do what you do? Are they the same people they've always been? Is there something they should bear in mind? I'm just curious to hear what you think about that.
When I talk to our new undergraduates when they come in, or even when I'm talking to prospective undergraduates and talking about what they might want to do as a career-wise, the most common answer is that they want to be, they want to go into academia, they want to do research, they want to do science as their career. And I think the advice I would give at that point is by all means go for it, but, bear in mind quite what a chancy thing it is. My whole career, as we've been talking about, is based on random things happening, and you end up kind of doing this random walk through your life. And the chances are, if you start in one place and want to get to another place and you're doing a random walk, the chances of you getting there are pretty low. So I think the important thing is just to kind of keep your options open as much as you can, and not fixate and not think somehow that you're personally a failure because if you don't get to where you wanted to get to, because so many things are outside your control. It's ridiculous to kind of beat yourself up if you just don't get where you originally planned to go.
Do you ever get people coming in here saying, I want to be an astronomer, I want to study astronomy, and you look at them and think, I don't think you should? Like obviously you would never say that to them, and everyone can do what they want, but like you hear their motivations or their strengths and that, and you think, I don't think you actually want to be an astronomer.
Except, if I look at my own motivations along the line, is they haven't actually been filled with glory in large part, or the fact that I got into astronomy at all because I was lazy as an undergraduate and wanted an easy option. There are many reasons people end up where they are, and it's not my place to say, actually, you know what, your motivation's bad here. I don't think that's the case. The other really important thing to say is, and again, this comes back to this kind of odds against success thing, is when I'm talking to people who are applying for PhDs or even, going through a PhD and thinking about their future career, these are people who are studying a quantitative subject. So I get them to do the quantitative analysis of saying, look, me personally, through my career, I've probably supervised before I retire, 20 or 30 PhD students, something like that. Just because that's, I take on a PhD student every couple of years and my career is 40 years. So maybe that's 20 PhD students. In a statistical sense, when I die, one of them gets my job, because actually if it's more than one, we end up with an exponentiating number of astronomers, and the world really couldn't deal with that, right? So that's the odds, right? That actually the odds are 20 to 1 or whatever it is, that it really is that hard a career path to follow, just because that's the way the numbers work out. And as long as you go into it with your eyes open and saying, okay, this is what I really want to do, but I recognize it's a long shot, and therefore, it's sensible to be thinking about what's plan B, that's fine. But I do worry when people say, I'm really, I want to be an astronomer, and I'm going to be an astronomer, and nothing's going to stop me. Because actually, almost certainly something will, just because, as I say, so much of it is not actually in your control.
What are some of those plan Bs? What are some of the good astronomy students you've had here gone on to do?
A huge array of stuff. So one of my recent PhD students has gone on to she's working for one of the finance companies in Nottingham now. So big finance houses, looking, again, analysing data and, looking for patterns in it. Very much the skills that she acquired as part of her PhD, she's now applying to analysing finance. Another PhD student, another recent graduate, he's now working for Ordnance Survey, actually down in Southampton. So going back to my roots.
Oh, I'd love to work for Ordnance Survey.
He's such a cool job. It really is. Because the thing that he turned out to be really good at in his PhD was coming up with clever ways of visualising data. And of course, he's taken that skill and he's using it enormously well now and doing all sorts of stuff of, he was modelling COVID spread in the pandemic. He's looking at water distribution now. Obviously, we have a bit of a water crisis at the moment in the UK. So looking at how you move water around and where the extra supply is, where the deficiencies are, all sorts of cool stuff like that he's involved in.
Ordnance Survey is sort of the mapping agency of the UK for those who don't know.
Yeah, they make maps. Yes.
Do you ever wish you were in a submarine? Did they change that submarine requirement?
They do now. I think, you don't need to, you only need 20/20 corrected vision now, not 20/20 uncorrected
So
vision.
you could do it.
So I'm a bit old to be a submariner at this point.
Do you ever wish you'd done that?
No, not really.
No,
so I have actually, so my wife has worked in various areas of administration, including local government. And so when we were living in Southampton, she was quite senior in the city council in Southampton, which meant we got invited to various receptions and things. I got to go along as Anne's spouse. And one of the receptions was the nuclear submarine HMS Southampton came to visit Southampton. And so we got to go and nose around a nuclear submarine and chat to the submariners and stuff. And I came away from that thinking, actually, you know what? I'm glad I didn't end up in one of these.
Too much like sardines? Or?
It really is pretty small. I hadn't realised quite, and so it's one of these things called an attack submarine. So it's not one of these big tactical submarines. It's quite a small submarine. And it really is very small.
Any other career you would like to have done? Do you ever look and think, oh, that's a cool job?
Well, it turns out I'm quite a good goalkeeper. So actually, maybe I should have been a footballer.
Footballer? Goalkeeper? Who would you like to have played for?
I don't know. Well, so it's one of these funny things. And it's sort of it's about people's expectations of you, right? When I was at school, I was kind of, the nerdy kid. And so no one would ever really pick me for the football team. just because it's just not what you do. But actually, when I moved to Nottingham, somebody was setting up a five-a-side team and they couldn't find a goalkeeper. And I said, well, that's all right, I'll give it a go. It turns out you only need two skills to be a goalkeeper. One is you need very fast reactions, and the other is you need absolutely no sense of self-preservation.
Yeah.
Right. And it turns out I had those things. And so I made a really good five-a-side goalkeeper, and, was the reason why our team really started succeeding, because I could keep most of the balls out of the net. So yeah, I could have had a career as a goalkeeper.
All right. Nice. Let me ask my cats in the cradle question. It felt like you pushed back against archaeology a bit because that was Dad's thing. You're now a dad.
Yep.
Does your young one have an interest in astronomy?
None at all. And in fact, so he's just finished his first year at university studying history. So he's gone back the other way.
It's oscillating.
Yeah.
Does he have an interest in your father's work?
Not at the moment. I mean, only in the abstract. He never. My dad died before he was born, so he never got to know him. So he only knows him kind of in the abstract. So I think he's sort of a little bit interested in the fact that his granddad was an archaeologist, but again, he's more interested in football than he is in history at this point.
Your dad wrote a really good book too, though, didn't he?
He wrote a bunch of books, actually. Yeah, he wrote, I mentioned there was this kind of paradigm shift of going from archaeology being all about rational explanations to all about ritual explanations. So he wrote this book called The Archaeology of Ritual and Magic, which is kind of the original kind of founding textbook of that whole discipline.
All right. Well, we'll link to your book and your dad's book.
Cool.
In the description. Well, that's all for today. Our thanks again to Jane Street, and a reminder their site is janestreet.com. Also, do take a look at the notes for this episode. I'll include links to 60 Symbols, the physics channel I mentioned earlier. Mike features really heavily there. And Deep Sky Videos, which has been a real labour of love for both Mike and myself. With the help of several other astronomers, we made 110 videos about each and every of the so-called Messier objects. This is a catalogue of galaxies and other phenomena which has a very special place in astronomy. Do check them out. I'm Brady Harron, you've been listening to the Numberphile podcast, and we'll be back again soon with another episode.